In the final days before Indiana Jones is forever ruined by the diarrhea of destiny, it's one of the last days to celebrate Indiana Jones while it's still fresh and clean. I've seen the leaks for the upcoming film. It had a horrible ending that was reportedly cut because it was that bad. They wanted to erase Indiana Jones from existence through time travel, and Harrison Ford himself hated the ending. This also would have been a massive retcon, given Indy is shown to be alive in the 1990s in the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles TV show by George Lucas. That I wanted to talk about eventually, but for now, let us direct our attention to Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. Before Temple of Doom resurged from the mixed reviews of the time, George and Spielberg were disappointed at how the film was received, so they wanted to make a movie that dialed back to Raiders of the Lost Ark. That probably wouldn't have been my idea, but it's something that worked in the past. It's noteworthy to say that Return of the Jedi was pretty much a movie like this. A movie that tries to recapture the spirit of the first movie. I've said previously that Last Crusade was my least favourite of the Indy films, although that's going to change very soon. And that's because it's the least original. Again, that's going to change very soon. There was always an undertone feeling of, haven't I seen this sort of shit before? I mean, they also try to do things a bit differently, but it's not that fresh, if that makes sense. Honestly, Indy's personal story was great, so maybe they could have tried to have different villains and change up the environments again. That probably would have helped Last Crusade stand out from the other two. I was under the impression that each Indy adventure is different, but obviously some adventures are going to share similarities with others. Looking at Indiana Jones as a franchise, the Nazis are the villains a lot of the time in external material, and personally that's fine, but in the mainstream film series, I would have expected a different villainous faction. Like, I know the Nazis are the biggest antagonistic faction, but they literally could have picked from a whole list of corrupt governments, or made up their own faction. I don't know. It rubbed me the wrong way that we're having the Nazis be the villains again. It's because the supporting villains are pretty much the same as the ones from Raiders. You can tell the difference between the cast of villains from Raiders versus Temple of Doom. Pat Roach, for example, played both the German mechanic and the slaver overseer in both respective movies. Both were heavily muscled villains for Indy to take on, but they're both different. The German mechanic was an arrogant dude who picked a fight with Indy, while the overseer was a brutal slaver with no remorse or mercy. They're both brutally killed in their respective fights, but they're distinguishable as well as their factions. If this film ever made a mistake, it was rehashing the villains from Raiders. However, the film's greatest strength is a highlight of the series as a whole, and even the repeated villains couldn't bring it down. I'm just saying they probably could have had new villains, but the start of this movie is actually pretty unique. So without further ado, let's talk about Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. So the movie starts off in the US state of Utah in 1912, which is over 20 years before the events of Temple of Doom or Raiders. As via Indy's date of birth in 1899, this makes Indy around 13 years old in the prologue. When you realize this prologue takes place in that year, you know we're in for a little origin story. Although to be honest, the opening sequence with the titles on screen is probably the weakest in the whole series. I don't know. In Raiders, it was a hike across the jungle with ominous music. In Temple of Doom, it was a creative musical number. And in Crystal Skull, it was Elvis Presley and Hound Dog all the way. John Williams' score sounds a bit too casual and innocent, if that's the right word. We see Indy as a Boy Scout with his group. The guy in charge tells everyone to dismount and not to wander off. But you want to know who wanders off? Indy, as well as his chubby sidekick Herman. They go into the mountains and come across some diggers in the area. Indy here is played by the late River Phoenix, who tragically died from an overdose way back in 1993, a mere 4 years after this film was released. River Phoenix was handpicked by Harrison Ford himself, because he was good at replicating his mannerisms, as well as the fact that he looked the most like Ford when he was his age. I also believe the Boy Scouts thing was based on Spielberg's childhood, but regardless, we see Indy and Herman spy on the diggers, who find the cross of Coronado. Indy explaining that the original owner in question was given the cross by the conquistador known as Cortez. Indy shows his roots here, as the diggers find the cross, intending to sell it to an unknown party. Indy tells Herman with a serious look that it belongs in a museum. There's also this little detail where we see that at this point, he's not afraid of snakes, as Herman is the one who is visibly fearful. Indy tells Herman to go and tell the local sheriff about the diggers, while he goes and takes the cross. Yeah, so he sneakily goes down the rope and swipes the cross before going back up the rope. But while climbing up, he makes a noise and the diggers are onto him. He rounds out and whistles for his horse, while the diggers and friends call for their transport. And here, it's a chase, and during all this, they come across a moving circus train. Oh boy. Out of all the things they could have run into, I thought the circus train was kind of clever, as they allowed a lot of unique scenarios to come and go. We start with giraffes, and when the diggers catch up to Indy, he opts to go through the carriage with reptiles in it. And it's here where his fear of snakes started, as he lands on a pile of snakes who crawl all over him. And contrary to last time, he hates snakes now. He fucking hates them. We cut to when he escapes, and he's come out a changed man. This prologue gives an origin story to 2 other of his gimmicks. Just you wait. As well as this, Indy during all this upsets a rhino, who almost punctures him around the area, and Indy seizes the opportunity to swing to another side of the train, until the digger leader, known in external material as Garth, confronts Indy, until he falls into a carriage with a lion in it. As anyone in this situation would do, he panics, and looks for a means of defense, and comes across his iconic bullwhip. He proceeds to grab it immediately, and starts whipping away at the lion, accidentally cutting himself in the chin, which is a neat detail due to the natural scar Harrison Ford has on his chin. The diggers offer to save him by tossing up the whip, and Indy does what he's told because what other choice does he have? Upon being pulled up, Garth tells him to give up, but the defiant Indy tells him that the cross belongs in a museum. He's able to break through due to a snake under his sleeve, and to finish off the circus train comes my favourite part. He enters a room full of magic, but upon realizing the door is locked, he goes under a magic box. By the time Garth comes in, he presumes Indy is under there, so he demands for him to get out. But then, presto, he's gone. He goes out of the carriage and sees Indy running away with the cross. He curses under his tongue, but you can see that he has a smirk of admiration. Indy runs into the house, calling for his dad, and we get a taste of the early relationship Indy has with his father. That being that his dad isn't the greatest father. Indy has something important to tell him, but his dad is far more concerned with writing stuff in his Grail diary, which comes full circle by the end. He gets Indy to count to 20, in Greek of course, and soon afterwards, Herman comes along with the sheriff, playing the bugle. Upon speaking to the sheriff, Indy gives the sheriff the cross of Coronado, and reveals that the owner of the cross, i.e. the diggers, won't press charges if he returns the cross. So yeah, Indy's battle here is lost. This was all a huge waste of time, as Indy has to give up the cross. So with that being said, we see the man in the Panama hat, who was also chasing Indy, give the hyperactive digger a check of money, with all others leaving the house. But Garth stays inside for a little bit. As shown visually earlier, he gives Indy a present as a show of admiration. And this is where we see where Indy got his iconic hat. That's actually a pretty interesting backstory, that he was stealing from the guy who gave him his iconic hat. I remember what Solo a Star Wars story was like, and how it was a shitty origin story for Han Solo, or at least how it was presented, because it was plain stupid. Here, we see that Indy earned the hat. In the next shot, we cut to 1938 around the Portuguese coast, where Indy, restrained on a ship, is confronted by the man in the Panama hat for a second time. The exchange the two give is excellent, with Indy affirming that the cross belongs in a museum, and the dude responds, "So do you." And he gets his men to throw Indy overboard. Although Indy does break free and struggles with the goons before pulling the old man down. Amidst all this is a terrible storm that adds to the tension. Indy steals the cross and then swings overboard as the ship loaded with TNT detonates from the storm and blows up. So with all that, this is an excellent way to start the movie. I'd say it's my second favourite opening, behind Raiders. It's a great start that is much like Raiders and Temple of Doom, but manages to differentiate itself as an origin story to a lot of Indy's gimmicks. After that mini-adventure, we're back to the Marshall College. Now, since they're dialing back to Raiders, they decided to implement 2 returning characters, the first of which is Marcus Brody, who did squat in Raiders, but I can say he's utilised as an actual character here. After Indy's done teaching, in which the class itself is foreshadowing a future scene interesting enough, Brody comes in with Indy delivering him the Cross of Coronado, an artifact which he worked so hard to acquire after that scuffle in 1912. Another reason I like this whole opening of the film is because it makes Indiana Jones' life feel more eventful. It's reason to say that he's always on the move, looking for another artifact, or defeating evil villains like the Thuggee cult. So anyways, Indy goes over to his office, but he's overwhelmed and swarmed by students, all pestering him for whatever reason, and Indy has to get past them to get into his office. He realizes they're not going away anytime soon, so to sneakily get away, he climbs out the window and walks outside. However, some men in a suspicious car show up and confront him. They look like trouble, and in the next scene, we see Indy in a fancy mansion. This is where we're introduced to the instigator for Indy's main journey. Although the quest was hinted at way earlier in the prologue, this is Walter Donovan, played by Julian Glover. Anyone familiar with Star Wars also knows him as General Veers. You might have also heard the theory that Indiana Jones was merely a dream Han Solo had in Carbonite. I personally don't like that theory because most of the time, making everything a figment of one's imagination makes for a terrible story. Even when I was a kid, the book Where the Wild Things Are pissed me off by the lackluster ending of it was all a dream. But at least the book wasn't that long, so I can't be too disappointed at the revelation. Well, point is, both franchises share an actor, except this time Julian Glover has more screen time and a more prominent role. Walter Donovan greets Indy in a friendly way, and at first glance, he seems that way. He apologizes for how his men got him here, but Indy isn't too concerned. He notes how he's donated a lot of stuff to the National Museum of History, and someone Indy would naturally trust in this line of work. Walter tells him that he has a breakthrough in a certain artifact, and shows him an old stone tablet, written in Latin. Roughly half of the tablet is lost, but Indy reads the rest of it, and realizes it hints towards the artifact for this movie, the Holy Grail. From what I remember of the behind-the-scenes featurettes, the Holy Grail was best known for being in the Monty Python film in the 70s, and Spielberg thought it was risky doing the Holy Grail in particular when everyone thought of that movie when it came to the Holy Grail in pop culture. The Holy Grail in this movie is rather impressive. We don't actually get to see what it looks like until the very end, but it's presented as being mystical just like all the other MacGuffins. Minus whatever the hell the time-traveling thing is supposed to be in Dial of Destiny. We mostly see it through drawings and characters talk about it a lot. In the context of this movie, and in real life too, it's noted as being the cup of Christ from the Last Supper, and whoever drinks from the cup is granted immortal life. Walter Donovan affirms this with an excited look. The dialogue discussing the Grail is great. Indy describes this as a bedtime story, and Donovan responds that it's certainly a story he'd like to wake up to, reminding Indy that finding the Grail was his father's dream, although we see that Indy isn't that excited at hearing the mention of his father. Donovan proceeds to talk about another story about how 3 knights from the First Crusade searched for the Grail. Only one returned to France, and spoke about the Grail and whatnot. Donovan speaks about a manuscript they found that proves the knight's story was true. Long story short, Donovan mentions how the project leader suspects that the knight's tomb is located in Venice, Italy. I also like Donovan's line where he says, quote unquote, "We're about to complete a great quest that began almost 2,000 years ago." This quote gets me every time. It has so much meaning on putting your place in history and finding a holy relic and so on. Later this line means something darker, but still, it comes across as grand at the same time. Donovan mentions how the main guy looking into the Grail has vanished, and how his colleague Dr. Schneider has no idea where he is. Indy suggests that they contact his father, but Donovan reveals that his father is the guy who vanished. Yeah, that's right, his father disappeared, and now this quest means more than just finding the Grail. So later that day, Indy heads over to his dad's place with Brody, and what do you know? The place is mysteriously ransacked. and Indy opens a package containing his father's Grail diary. He references how it was sent to him, and I remember how he came across this package when he collected it in his office. Seeing all this, and looking at frames in his dad's place concerning the legends of the Holy Grail, Indy has a change of heart, and decides he'll take Donovan's ticket overseas. So before the flight takes, Brody also decides to come along. So just before the flight takes off, Donovan tells Brody that Dr. Schneider has a place in Venice, and to Indy, Donovan tells him to be careful and not to trust anybody. I fucking knew where this was going as soon as I heard this line, but anyways, Indy and Brody fly all the way over to Venice, and the place looks really nice. I should know, because I've actually been to Venice before. It's a popular tourist attraction in Italy besides Rome. The floating city was also featured in Assassin's Creed 2, and I recognize so many of the landmarks. My family even had pizza, which, I'm more used to the American version of pizza. So anyways, searching around for Dr. Schneider, they're greeted by the person in question, an Austrian woman. They went into Venice thinking it was going to be a dude, but actually, it's this chick. I fucking knew that this was essentially going to be Indy's gal for this movie. Although, as it turns out, there's a price this time. Well, anyways, Elsa Schneider talks about how Indy's father disappeared. She has no idea where he is. And the lead he had on the Tomb of the Grail is near a library, in which Brody comments it looks more like a converted church. Basically, during all this, Indy uses his detective skills, using his father's Grail diary, as well as Roman numerals in the library. He finds the numbers 3, 7, and 10, proclaiming that when he finds the 10, that X marks the spot, a callback to what he said in his class where X never marks the spot. Well, Indy decides to bash open the ground with a blunt object standing around, and we get a scene where this dude that sort of looks like Mark Twain, stamping books, mistakenly thinks that Indy's pounding is coming from his stamper, for a bit of visual humor. Anyways, Indy and Elsa make their way down, while I suppose Brody stays up as a lookout. The former two in question go to explore the Venetian tomb, and the intrigue here is great. The whole movie manages to maintain a whole form of mystery, right until the very end. As soon as Indy and Elsa go exploring, some dudes, who by their shadowy nature, and obviously spell bad news, come in to intercept the search for the tomb. They knock out Brody swiftly, and it's here where we cut back to Indy and Elsa, in which they make their way through the tomb, encountering a reference to the Ark of the Covenant, which I suppose is meant to be a callback, and come across a little creepy crawly moment when they come across a horde of giant rats, and they have to make it past the unsanitary critters.
What's that smell? What? What is that? Is that for rats or mice? Look at them all.
They hike across the rat-infested area and find the Tomb of the Grail Knight, finding the full inscription that was missing in the first half. And the two are joyful over finding the pivotal clue. And it's here where Indy mentions that his dad would have never made it past the rats. Because just like Indy's phobia of snakes, he fucking hates them. However, the mysterious men light a fire in the catacombs, obviously in an attempt to kill Indy and Elsa. Well, Indy and Elsa manage to escape the catacombs getting caught on fire, and swim out onto the streets of Venice. But the mysterious men, determined to kill both of them, chase them outside, in which Indy starts a speedboat for the both of them to escape, and it's another chase sequence. The group of men chase the pair across Venetian waters, in which Indy in a classic fashion beats them up. There's actually a part where Elsa mishears Indy to go in between two ships, and this is a mistake that almost gets them crushed. Around taking out one of the boats chasing them, it leads to a confrontation between the last boat. And I really like John Williams' score here. Very dramatic and intense. When Indy's about to take out the last guy, in which the last guy responds that they're looking for the Holy Grail, Indy asks whether or not they killed his father, given he was looking for the Grail too, in which the dude responds no. It's here where Indy is given a choice of sparing the dude, or they both die. He ultimately prepares to spare the dude, in which he demands to tell him where his father is. Upon being questioned, the man tells Indy that his name is Kazim, and he's part of a secret society known as the Brotherhood of the Cruciform Sword, an organization dedicated to keeping the Holy Grail safe and hidden. He asks Indy a question on why he seeks the Grail. Is it for his father's glory or his? And Indy responds that his goal is to find his father, in which Kazim tells him that his father is held captive in Brunwald Castle, located around the German-Austrian border. Now I have to question given what's revealed later, but I'll save it for when the revelation comes. We cut back to Elsa's place, in which Indy and Brody have a look at the inscription, which completed, reveals that the Grail is located around the city of Alexandretta, which no longer exists, instead replaced by the city of Iskenderun, probably butchered that name. And they pieced together through his father's Grail diary that his father figured out the path to the Canyon of the Crescent Moon, where the Grail is located, except he had no idea where to begin the trail. Well, now that they know, Indy sends Brody to go to the city in Turkey, while he intends to go look for his father. This is around the time the romance between Indy and Elsa starts, as they basically embrace each other, kind of rudely. So I presume they slept together off screen, and then took a trip from Italy to Austria by car near Salzburg. So to describe the whole Venetian sequence of the movie, it's still pretty good. The mystery plot and the engagement I had in seeing Indy and friends piece things together was interesting, as well as it drip feeding us with even more mystery to be solved. Because what are stories but mystery boxes? I'm so sorry. When Indy and Elsa arrive to the castle in question, it's raining, and Indy has a plan to enter the castle. He and Elsa swap hats, in which Indy puts on this really silly Scottish accent. The dude at the door has all of his questions deflected, and his face eventually smacked cold. And now it's here, where we find out the villainous faction for this movie. The Nazis. Again, I'm saying it like that because YouTube doesn't like how it's actually pronounced. So you've already heard my complaint about this movie. When you're making a trilogy, you gotta make all three entries stand apart in some way. And Last Crusade was made with the mentality of, let's make a movie that feels like the first one, which is perhaps the biggest mistake it made. And yes, my criticism falls on both Lucas and Spielberg. It's easy for anyone to vilify the Nazis. Like, for Christ's sake, the officers have skulls on their hats. That's how you know they're the bad guys. And top it with historical context and yep, the man with the silly mustache ran a tyrannical regime that targeted many, many people. Even though the faction and the ideology itself was destroyed and largely discredited forever, the damage it did cannot be undone. It made the country of origin, Germany, a stain that cannot be cleaned. Ever. As well as setting back natural progress decades. For example, the silly mustache man's regime targeted the Institute for Sexual Science, a progressive organization way ahead of its time, which researched heavily into sexuality. And yes, that includes the gay community. You want to know what happened to it? Well, silly mustache man happened. And he shut down the institute and then arrested the main dude, Magnus Hirschfeld, for being Jewish. All the potential progress made for gay rights was obliterated, and it only started to pick up again around the 90s and 2000s, I'd say. Of the countries that legalized gay marriage, mostly in the West, it was either the 2000s or 2010s. Silly mustache man happening was one of the worst things that happened ever. I think I'm getting off track, but I just wanted to vent some history about why the Nazis suck, and how such a fanatical regime made things worse. Now, I'm not saying they can't do the Nazis ever again, because I'm fine with plenty of expanded universe stories having them, such as the video games, comics, and novels, but you'd think they'd try to make the main series more unique? Like after Temple of Doom, Indy was going to be a franchise no matter what. So you'd think you'd totally inspire a new faction to introduce into the series. Not only to make the third movie stand out, but also to inspire other authors. I don't know who could have been the alternate bad guys in the 1930s or 40s landscape instead of the Nazis, but you could easily make up a faction like the Thuggee cult. They did the Soviets in Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, and leaned towards more 1950s stuff. So it annoys me that we're just doing the Nazis again, and they're not unique with the same antagonist. They're having the Nazis search for another religious artifact. Last time, it was the Ark of the Covenant. This time, it's the Holy Grail. There's some stuff regarding the repeated antagonists I do like, but the rehash villains make the movie more predictable, if that's the right word. We all know that Indy's antagonists are going to die at the end. We know that, like Raiders, Indy's going to beat the shit out of them, and the Nazis are going to play the same role as the first movie, just with a different MacGuffin. I don't know. I sort of dropped a little bit of interest when I saw the fascists again. Making Last Crusade Indy's most personal story is what prevents it from being a lame rehash all around, but still, I'm disappointed about how much they tried to replicate Raiders, especially after seeing how different Temple of Doom was. I was given the impression that each movie had a different flavor to it. Raiders was basically the anti-Nazi vengeance movie, and Temple of Doom was the literal dark cult classic, and so on. Indy's personal story makes this movie stand out from the others enough, but I wish it was more different. And having the Nazis be the villains again was a mistake in my opinion. With how Temple of Doom managed to set itself apart while still being as consistently enjoyable, even if the first one is better, I'm kinda disappointed. I could already predict certain elements of the movie. Also, since they're bringing Marcus Brody and a certain someone back, it felt too much like a callback. I expect Dial of Destiny to be much worse with its rehashing, but I just wanted to give my take. So I'd just say that around 30% of The Last Crusade bummed me out with the presence of the Nazis. So anyways, the Nazis are the villains again. Indy remarks how he hates these guys, and it's meant to be a callback to Raiders. Something I don't quite understand though, is why they don't really have callbacks to Temple of Doom too. Like a reference to that movie would be welcome too if we're also referencing Raiders. I don't know. It's just that the standalone nature of Temple of Doom has me think that Indy changed its identity and formula come Last Crusade. Indy sneaks around the castle with Elsa, and it's here where he discovers where his dad is, behind a wired door. So he goes to the next room over and whips his way to his dad's room, leaving Elsa behind, telling her to wait. He busts into his dad's cell essentially, and before we get to see his face, his dad smashes him over the head with a vase. Now this is Henry Jones, played by the late Sean Connery, RIP legend. And in one of his most iconic roles aside from James Bond, he plays Indy's dad. And what a dad he is. Yeah, so Henry Jones is shown to us as an older version of Indy, who definitely shows his age, being the father of a man in his late 30s after all, which, fun fact, Harrison Ford and Sean Connery are less than 10 years apart in age, but Connery easily passes off as an older man. Still though, even though both actors knew they were relatively close in age, they still convincingly play a father and son. Despite Indiana Jones being an American man, his dad is Scottish, as per the nationality of the actor playing him. Just like Short Round being Chinese, I think Henry Jones having an American accent wouldn't be as special, even if it was Sean Connery's hypothetical American equal playing him, or Connery got an accent coach. I don't know. In general, the characters in Indiana Jones are actually pretty diverse in nationality. Let's list off the main ones. Indy is American, Henry is Scottish, Brody is English, Belloc is French, the Nazi villains are German or Austrian, most characters after Temple of Doom's prologue are Indian, Short Round is Chinese, Sulla is Egyptian, Kazim is Turkish, the Soviet villains are either Russian or Ukrainian, in the case of Irina Sparko. Yeah, we've got a lot of national representation here. I know Indy isn't politically correct, but you've got characters from all sorts of different countries, not just from the West. Yeah, I know Indiana Jones is white, but he's quite the multiculturalist, making friends from all around the world, people with different backgrounds, nationally and culturally. Well anyways, Henry refers to Indy as Junior, and Indy responds, "Yes sir," which is how their interactions usually go. As Indy's recovering from the injury on his head, his dad doesn't apologize at all. He just examines the vase and talks about how he broke something so priceless, until he realizes it's a fake, and he's more relieved that he didn't break something expensive. That might sound douchey, and it is, but it's presented in a funny and light-hearted way. Sean Connery nailed it. Well, actually, he does apologize afterwards, but it's in a line of passing dialogue. Indy brings his dad up to speed on what he discovered in Venice, and we even see him be as giddy as a schoolboy as Indy proudly announces what he found to his dad. Of course, Henry says he wishes he was there, until being told that there were rats all around. Based on what's said, their mutual happiness is about to go sour. When Henry talks about how he wanted to get the diary as far away from him as possible, and Indy has this priceless look where he tells the camera, "Oh fuck, I brought the diary here." Seconds later, the Nazi swarm in with guns, demanding he give up the diary. And given that they're both called Dr. Jones, the two jinx each other when addressed. But Henry laughs in the Nazi's face, affirming that his son would never be stupid enough to bring the diary back. But he slowly realized his captor wasn't joking in the slightest. Indy brought the diary with him, right into the arms of the enemy. So the two have a brief argument, but Indy does use it as a distraction to beat the shit out of the Nazis who threaten them both at gunpoint. That's one way to take out some fascists. I also want to mention Henry's famous line after he realizes his son brought the diary back, saying, quote, "I should have sent it to the Marx Brothers." Turns out that was referencing a group of Jewish comedians who would very much stay far the fuck away from the domain of silly mustache man. I'm not very familiar with 1930s pop culture. I mean, I saw Scarface. No, not that Scarface. The original one directed by Howard Hawks. That was later remade in the 80s with Al Pacino in the lead role. Point is though, I always wondered for the longest time who the Marx Brothers were supposed to be. Anyways, Indy goes back to get Elsa, and it's revealed here passively that she's a Nazi. Although supporting antagonist Colonel Ernst Vogel, introduced in this very scene, threatens Elsa's life. Henry tells Indy not to trust Elsa, but Indy doesn't listen, and instead throws away his gun to save her. And he finds out the hard way that she practices the salute. Well, that's a way to make Indy's love interest this time around different, making her one of the villains, and it's done well. It gives Indy a dilemma on how to approach someone he's grown to care about, but also hate because she betrayed him. It makes things as personal as someone like Belloc in a different way. Anyways, since Indy gave up his machine gun, he's captured, and he finds out who the main bad guy is. And to be betrayed once again, it's Walter Donovan. Before it's directly revealed though, Indy asks how his dad knew that she was a Nazi, and in a completely improvised line, Henry remarks that she talks in her sleep. Yeah, that's right. Both father and son have a bitch in common. Gross. I'm also not kidding that this was a line Connery came up with. It made everyone laugh on set, so they kept it in. This is also tied into Donovan's earlier line, because as he reveals himself, he reminds Indy on what he said about not trusting anyone. Yeah, Walter Donovan, as it turns out, is a traitor to his own country. Now, I mentioned earlier that there's an issue I sort of noticed in relation to Kazim's exposition. If Kazim knows where Henry is being kept, then why didn't he elaborate that the Nazis were the ones holding him captive? And as well as that, wouldn't his organization know about the people looking for the Grail, like Elsa and Donovan? Okay, maybe not Elsa given she was a double agent and not higher ranked in the exposition, but surely Donovan? I don't know. I guess they wanted reveals to happen at the detriment of the thing making sense. It's very important information Kazim left out. Thinking about it, it is a valid question that comes to mind. However, that's an infrequent case of bad writing this movie has. Fortunately for the both of them, Indy had the foresight to rip out some of the pages and gave them to Brody. Although Henry points out that he sticks out like a sore thumb, but Indy taunts Donovan that Brody's a master of hiding and they'll never find him, blah blah. We cut straight to Brody in the city, where he's greeted by Sulla, who you should also remember from Raiders. Sulla is well utilized in this film. Brody, like Donovan said, doesn't do a good job of keeping a low profile. Some Nazi agents catch Brody and Sulla instantly, and there's this exchange where Sulla tries to speak to Brody in code to run, but he doesn't catch on until Sulla is forced to punch one of the German agents and yells for him to run. Although Brody is eventually driven by a truck he tried to hide in. Little nitpicky here, but despite the speed of the truck being slow enough to run after, Sulla just looks on in defeat. Like, come on, I'd be running after that truck, grabbing on and telling Brody to jump. Yes, I would love a self-insert character for this adventure, but that's what night dreams are for, since I commonly dream about being a part of whatever fictional story. Hopefully after I publish this video, I'll dream about accompanying Indy in one of the movies, but no Dial of Destiny. We cut back to Indy and Henry tied up, and Vogel orders Elsa back to Berlin, and Elsa decides to give a seemingly final goodbye to Indy, although Henry talks to her too, She kisses Indy passionately and tells him that's how Austrians say goodbye. If you remember the movie well, you know that as soon as she walks away, Vogel shows Indy how they say goodbye in Germany specifically. And it's a hard punch to the face. Out of all of Vogel's lines, this has to stand out as the most memorable. This is one of my favourite lines in the movie in general, maybe in the entire series. If there are any Germans watching, please tell me in the comments if you've ever knocked out someone when saying goodbye, because I imagine Germany is the country with the most concussions. Jokes aside, they're stuck in the large room, and Indy tries to figure out a way to break free. So he proceeds to get his dad to reach into his pocket for his cigarette lighter. Wait, did they just forget to pat Indy down for weapons? Okay, that might be another case of bad writing. I guess it doesn't do much because Henry quickly drops the lighter and accidentally burns the carpet. Yeah, that's right, he makes the situation worse. They try to move away from the fire, but they're quickly caught onto by the Nazis. However, Indy is able to break himself free and his dad, and they counter-trap the Nazis inside the burning room. They probably died a horrible death, but nobody watching cares. Unless you're a neo-Nazi hate watching this, because you believe silly mustache man did nothing wrong. Well, anyways, Indy and Henry make it outside. Indy sets the speedboat off while planning to use the motorcycle, and I actually have the Funko Pop of that. I figured I wanted both characters, so this was the perfect solution. Anyways, when Vogel and his men make it outside, they hop on the speedboats, and the Jones boys speed past on a motorcycle, hitting racist and more racist on the way. Yeah, those are my nicknames for those two goons. It's another chase sequence of outrunning the fascists. To be honest, I said that the movie in relation to the villains kinda drags it down. It's not as interesting as Raiders. And while the chase is enjoyable, it's not as consistently enjoyable. I suppose I prefer it when Ford and Connery play off of each other for the rest of the movie. There is a part where Indy jousts a biker Nazi with a flagpole, but this scene kind of feels like a chase sequence from Raiders too much. I guess the change of scenery is nice, but that's about it. I don't have much to say about this sequence. So let's just skip to when they successfully evade silly mustache man's border patrol, because they're on the German-Austrian border after all. Indy is headed for Brody's direction, but Henry tells them to stop and says that they need to go get the diary, which Elsa has in Berlin. And Henry explains that it's not just the map they need, but there's also other important stuff in the Grail diary, such as tips they'll need when they get to the site of the Grail. There are 3 trials one must do in order to get to the Grail, but when asked by Indy, his dad has that look. Henry doesn't remember. He wrote everything in his diary so he wouldn't have to. Ha ha ha! That actually makes sense. Sometimes you can't remember everything, so you write it down. The Grail diary was pretty much a cheat sheet posing as a journal, wasn't it? Indy responds how Brody is also important, but Henry simply remarks how Brody would agree with them. Indy swears Jesus Christ under his breath, and his dad slaps him for blasphemy. Henry then explains in his first serious moment, and the music changes in tone too. Brilliant exposition if I have ever seen it.
The quest for the Grail is not archaeology. It's a race against evil. If it is captured by the Nazis, the armies of darkness will march all over the face of the earth. Do you understand me?
Henry trying to get Indy to understand the stakes of finding the Grail. The closest speech I've seen in a fictional story is also a franchise that has Nazis as the antagonists, and elements of the occult.
You sure killed that big fucking monster proper, BJ. The biggest one is still out there. This may be our last chance to topple the Nazi Empire. Now it's time to get it done, eh? And the world is counting on us and all that. No pressure. Except my goddamn bladder.
I don't think it's any coincidence the modern Wolfenstein developers are working on an Indiana Jones game. Out of all the studios, they actually seem like a good fit. There's a lot of similarities between Wolfenstein and Indiana Jones. Yeah, I'm really a fan of fictionalized World War II shit. Anyways, Indy decides to listen to his pa and drive to the capital of Germany. As such, we are met with the center of all the hate. It's a parade of book burnings and touting the fascist flag all over the place. I presume they tracked Elsa off screen, maybe Indy had friends or contacts in Berlin. And maybe it's explained in the novelization. Point is, Indy dresses in a Nazi uniform and confronts Elsa, pissed as all hell. He grabs the diary from her pocket, although Elsa plays the victim here, saying that she believes in the Grail. But Indy isn't interested in hearing it. He grabs Elsa and threatens to strangle her to death, but you know how Indy is with his bitches. He can't do it, so he just walks away. Well, anyways, Indy and Henry try to get out of Germany, but they're swarmed by people with books and pens, clearly wanting an autograph from a certain someone. Yeah, this is where Indy comes face to face with,
Oh my God, it's Hitler! He's back! He's back! Hurry, protect John Stewart! He's our most important Jew!
Yeah, silly mustache man himself grabs Indy's book and signs it, before giving it back to him. Now Henry's Grail diary is worth something to neo-Nazis if it's still around today. Well, anyways, Indy and Henry go to the Berlin airport, intending to take the first flight out of Germany. They go with manufactured passports, which implies my theory about Indy having friends in Berlin who probably made some fake IDs for him and his dad. They go into a Zeppelin or a blimp, whatever, and for once it seems they can relax. But since escaping Deutschland is no holiday, of course Vogel shows up and has a search for Indy and Henry. Indy disguises himself as one of the flight staff, and just as Vogel is about to catch Henry, Indy punches him out of the Zeppelin, where he falls into his luggage as the aircraft takes off. Yeah, there is some of the crappiest green screen in the whole series, as Vogel shakes his fist at Indy and Henry, although you can tell he's not really there. Well, anyways, Indy and Henry can finally get out of Germany, in which they discuss a lot. This is where Indy sort of calls out his dad for never being a good father. Henry gets defensive and proclaims that he was a great father because he minded his own business and taught him self-reliance. Indy snaps back, obviously, by saying that all he ever taught him was that he never mattered enough compared to people who died 1,000 years ago. Yeah, it's shown that Henry isn't the best father once again. He was never abusive, but he wasn't supportive either. He was just there. He was a guardian for Indy, but never someone who took the time to support his son on anything he did. I know I can't relate to this, because my parents were great, being supportive and caring. My dad was a lot calmer than my mother, but my mum was often overworked, and still is, come to think of it. I'm like 20 years old, and I've never had a lasting strain with my parents, but I imagine a lot of people in the world have. It would have been nice if Indy had a supportive father, but he didn't. And his mother, as referenced earlier, wasn't around for most of his life, dying of an unspecified illness before the prologue of this very movie. This is what I mean where I say this is Indy's most personal story yet. The second most personal was probably Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, because you know it concerned his son. But here is where Indy faces the toughest relationship, that being with his dad. Although Indy isn't sure what to talk about specifically after a certain point, so his dad presents him with the 3 challenges of the Grail. Test 1, the breath of God. Only the penitent man will pass. Test 2, the word of God. Only in the footsteps of God will he proceed. Test 3, the path of God. Only in the leap of the lion's head will he prove his worth. I love how these 3 tests are worded. Very majestic. However, the Zeppelin turns around, and Indy and Henry need to escape. So they take a plane attached to the Zeppelin and flee. They are pursued by Nazi pilots. Henry also doesn't pick up on military clock cues, and he accidentally shoots off a vital piece of the plane, and they're forced down to the ground. So the Jones boys in the countryside pull a Grand Theft Auto on an old man and drive off, still pursued by the pilots. One of the pilots follow the pair through the tunnel and dies unsurprisingly. The other pilot tries to bomb them, but Henry has quite a unique way of taking out the second pilot. He uses his umbrella to get a flock of birds to cover the view of the pilot, in which he can't see, and yep, he's dead. Henry talks about what he just did, and then we cut to the Republic of Haiti, or Hete, I don't know how it's pronounced, in which Donovan gets the Sultan or whoever to give him free reign, along with an escort to the Grail. And the Sultan in return gives him a top-notch car for the time. It's also here where we see Kazim again, blending in and watching the Nazis and the Sultan. Indy and Henry meet up with Sulla, in which they decide to tail the Nazi-armed escort, and Indy and friends observe the escort from a distance. Although Donovan notices their presence through refraction or whatever, and orders his tanks to fire at them. Yep, now Indy and friends have no transport. That's when once in a while, Indy and friends have an unlikely distraction to help them. Kazim and his secret Brotherhood buddies ambush the Nazi escort, buying Indy and friends the time they need, although Kazim is killed in the process. In his last words, he tells Donovan and Elsa that as a messenger from God, may damnation claim the unworthy with the cup of Christ. Henry tries to rescue Brody by himself, but he's captured by Vogel and his men. So now it's up to Indy and Sulla. I like Henry's line where he remarks that fascists like him should read books instead of burning them. Then Donovan comes by and tells Vogel that Jones is getting away. Vogel tells him that he thinks not, until Donovan points out that he means the other Jones, and cue the classic Indiana Jones theme. Now, I'm not a big fan of the chase in this scene. It's a lot like the one in Raiders of the Lost Ark, and there's nothing that makes it truly different, which is sort of why I wish they didn't rehash the Nazis. If there was ever an example of the repeat villains hampering this film, it's this scene. It's the same shit we've already seen before. Indy pursues Vogel's tank and manages to free both Brody and his dad. I suppose I do like the part where he shoots a couple of Nazis with one bullet, but anything I said about Raiders' chase sequence with the Ark escort applies here. Except for maybe the fact that they don't have the MacGuffin yet. I will say that I like how this ends. With Indy and Vogel still in the tank, Indy jumps off screen, but Vogel, still in the tank, falls over the cliff and dies horribly. And at first, Henry, Sulla and Brody think Indy perished along with them. And it's here where we see Henry did truly care for his son despite his estranged relationship. Thankfully, Indy was fine, although he's exhausted, and lost his hat, although he does find his hat eventually. And now it's on to the Canyon of the Crescent Moon. Yeah, that's right, we've got the finale. Donovan and the remaining Nazis make it to the Grail site first, although Indy and friends are not far behind. Upon Indy and friends reaching the site, they spy on Donovan, as a volunteer tries to make it past the first test, the Breath of God. Only the penitent man will pass. Is this random guy penitent? Well, I mean, he does regret having volunteered to step forward, and he does see that the other two guys before him lost their heads, and soon gets his own head sawed off. Yeah, this is the closest I get to feeling bad for a random villain in an Indiana Jones movie. Donovan also dismisses his death by asking for another volunteer, although Indy and friends are held at gunpoint and exposed to Donovan. Donovan, in a snarky, smug voice, tells Indy that he's going to get the Grail for him. He also shows that he doesn't care that he's betrayed his country, but he shows how low he can go when Indy points out that shooting him won't get him anywhere. And Donovan agrees, so he shoots his dad instead. Not in a spot that kills him instantly, but in an area where he will bleed out eventually. Yeah, that's where Indy is forced to go get the Grail, because it's the only thing that can save his dad. So that's where Indy has no choice but to help Donovan get the Grail. Indy repeats the line from the Grail diary, and dodges the blades by ducking and rolling, and turns off the mechanism. He realizes he needed to kneel before God, and the thing was, penitent means being regretful of doing something wrong. So that's the first obstacle out of the way. Slow and tense, and right as the blades come, Indy ducks in time. Although the second test seems more passable realistically, it's still dangerous. In this test, Indy realizes he has to spell out the name of God, Jehovah, except he needs to spell it out in Latin. He makes the mistake of doing it in English, stepping on J first, and almost falls to his death. He realizes what he actually has to do, and so he spells out God's Latin name correctly. Lastly, the path of God. Only in the leap of the lion's head will he prove his worth. Otherwise, it's a chasm without a bridge across. Brody reminds him that he has to act quickly, and his dad tells him quietly that he must believe to complete the test. He believes he can make the leap, and is rewarded by an optical illusion bridge that he can stand on. Eventually, he enters the resting place of the Holy Grail, and in comes a minor character with great impact. As referenced earlier in the movie, one of the Grail Knights stayed behind, while his two brothers went out. The Grail Knight is here, still alive, but old and frail. He is played by the late Robert Edison, mostly known for stage productions. Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade was one of his last roles, before passing away 2 years after this film released. He was 83 when he died, so yeah, pretty damn old. It's shown that the Grail Knight has stayed in this site for over 850 years. The Grail Knight does try to give up his sword to Indy to pass him down as the new Guardian of the Grail, but Donovan and Elsa come in, with Donovan holding a gun. He notices that there's many cups, and asks the Grail Knight which one it is. The Grail Knight simply responds that he has to choose the right one, but he must choose wisely. Picking the wrong Grail results in death. So this is where Donovan has to rely on Elsa to pick out the right Grail. Something I don't quite understand is why wasn't he more cautious about picking out the right Grail? I say this because since there's a lot of them, it could be any one of them. Now I understand that he wouldn't want to force Indy to pick it out and test drink it, because obviously his enemy would then be immortal, but Donovan could have, I don't know, threaten Brody or Sulla's life and get Indy to pick out the right Grail, otherwise he dies. In fact, I don't know why he didn't just execute Indy here. He served his purpose. Donovan was such an imposing, treacherous villain since his introduction, but his demise kind of just falls flat because he wasn't careful enough. He trusts Elsa to pick out the right Grail, and you can tell it's obviously the wrong one, but Donovan finds it beautiful and majestic. And yeah, it's a nice cup, but upon drinking from the Grail, thinking he'll get eternal life, he deteriorates rapidly, and becomes a skeleton in seconds. Only late 80s special effects could make it look this creepy. Indy pushes Donovan's corpse away from Elsa, and yep, he's dead. But does anyone care? Nope. He was perhaps the second most ruthless Indiana Jones villain, behind Mola Ram, provided Mola Ram isn't under the black sleep of Kali. But anyways, the Grail Knight remarked that he chose poorly, so Indy has to pick out the right Grail, in which he searches through the cups, reasoning that if it's not the prettiest cup in the lot, it must be a cup that is realistic for the time. He picks out a specific cup, noting that it's the cup of a carpenter, which I presume Jesus was, because I don't know much about Christian law. But anyways, he takes a sip, and yep, he picked the right one. He quickly rushes to his dad's side, and pours the water from the cup on his dad's wounds, instantaneously healing him, and reversing Donovan's inflicted bullet wound, and the two hug. Now the Grail Knight said while the Grail does give immortality, it isn't allowed past a certain point. Well, who would ruin it but Elsa, who gets a little greedy and tries to take the Grail past that point despite Indy's warnings. She doesn't listen, and the whole site crumbles apart, invalidating Indy's and Henry's immortality. Oh well, maybe they can retrieve it and put it in a museum? Well, the thing is, the Grail is dropped amongst the place falling apart and rumbling. Elsa drops it, and almost falls to her death, but Indy catches her, trying to get her to give him her other hand. She doesn't listen, the glove slips off, and yep, that's the end of Elsa. Although Indy almost falls himself, although he almost makes the same mistake, as his father does catch him, but Indy is tempted by the Grail too. Henry by this point shows that he cares more about his son than the Grail, and calls him Indiana, the first time in this film, and tells him simply to let it go. I remember Spielberg describing this moment as Henry getting his son to realize that he matters more than the Grail. So Indy breaks out of his temptations, and Henry is able to pull him up, and they escape from the temple. And before leaving for good, the Grail Knight waves them goodbye, deciding to go down with the temple. Once outside, Indy looks on, obviously thinking about Elsa, and his father tells him something important about her.
Elsa never really believed in the Grail. She thought she'd found a prize.
And Henry, despite not possessing the Grail, is satisfied on what he did gain, reconciliation with his son. Anyways, they get on the horses, ready to be off, with Hindi referring to Indy as Junior again. Sulla asks what Junior is supposed to mean, and we get one of the final lines for a long time. In the main series, at least until another 20 years. Turns out Indy's given name is Henry Jones Jr. Indy tells him that he has since adopted the name Indiana, and Henry reminds him that the house dog's name was Indiana. Sulla of course jokingly mocks him for being named after the dog, and the four of them ride off into the sunset, bringing an end to the adventure. And that was Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. So yeah, relatively good movie. The story between Indy and his father was one of the best subplots in the entire series. However, the film doesn't cover new grounds for the franchise, and it probably inspired a lot of Indy adventures to just have the Nazis as the bad guys. I wish they tried something different for Last Crusade, because I do truly love the personal story. It's just that the wider plot and the stakes are pretty much the same as Raiders, just with a different religious MacGuffin. This movie was very reactive to how Temple of Doom was originally received. If only Lucas and Spielberg had the foresight to see how Temple of Doom is revered today as a classic, different prequel to Raiders. I've said before that I thought that Last Crusade was the weakest, and that's true. It's still an easy 8 point something out of 10 movie, probably even in the late numbers approaching a 9, but it's the mistake of repeat villains that drags us down a notch. Still though, the film manages to hold up despite its big flaw, and it in no way ruins the movie. So now with the original Indiana Jones trilogy complete, and having already done my part to defend Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, it's now our final days before Dial of Destiny comes out, and tarnishes a franchise that was better left alone. It's a miracle Disney left it alone for as long as they did, but now that a new movie's coming out, a movie that drags Indiana Jones down, where Harrison Ford shows his age, and also a stupid time travel plot that doesn't make any sense, as well as doing the Nazis for the third time in a major film. I will especially refuse to give them a free pass there. A franchise isn't going to move forward if you don't innovate. That's the key lesson that Disney needs to learn. Helena Shaw is probably going to be the most hated character in the franchise, being Kathleen Kennedy's pretentious self-insert. And I expect very little references to Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. In fact, I imagine they'll try to undo a lot of what happens in it. Something I'm also interested in is seeing how they'll butcher it, as the main villain played by Mads Mikkelsen will apparently want to change the past to make sure the Nazis win so he can ensure a future he desires, but he's also going to travel to 1944 specifically, a year where the Nazis were going to lose no matter what. I mean, even without the D-Day landings, they were being steamrolled by the Soviets, so that doesn't make much sense. Shouldn't they go back to 1932 or 1933, when Silly Mustache Man first secured power, and oversee World War II with the power of hindsight, and prevent the Mustache Man from making the arrogant mistakes he made? By killing Indiana Jones in the past too, that might mean that every plan he thwarted would be prevented as well. So I have to ask, why the hell you would travel to 1944 when the Nazis are obviously losing the war and Silly Mustache Man's fate is sealed? Maybe I'm overthinking an Indiana Jones movie, but no Nazi with access to a time travel device would think of going to the year before the war ended. In fact, depending on when the main bad guy travels in 1944, he might be way too fucking late to save the Third Reich. So yeah, that's why time travel plots have become a huge rabbit hole of plot holes, and why didn't you do this or that? Because of the butterfly effect. Anyways, that's my preview of Indiana Jones and the Diarrhea of Destiny. May Jesus forgive us. I'm JJ Plagiarisms. And until next time, what are stores but mystery boxes?
Under the mountain, a golden fountain. Were you praying at the Loris shrine? But oh, your city